The courtroom was filled with an uneasy stillness, the kind that made every rustle of paper and shifting of chairs sound deafening. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a cold glow over the rows of spectators, some leaning forward in anticipation, others whispering among themselves. Danica Whitmore sat at the defendant's table, her hands resting on the polished wood surface. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the stares from the jury, the murmur of the gallery, the unwavering gaze of the judge. But she kept her face composed. A lifetime of navigating corporate boardrooms had trained her to remain calm under scrutiny, yet this was different. This wasn't a quarterly financial review. This was her life on trial. The prosecutor, a tall man with slick-back hair and a voice as sharp as a blade, stepped forward. He held up a stack of papers, his expression a mask of unwavering confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing deliberately, "what we have here is not just a case of financial misconduct. This is premeditated fraud, an act so calculated that the defendant left behind an irrefutable trail of evidence." He gestured toward the large screen at the front of the courtroom. A spreadsheet filled with financial data flashed into view. These transactions, unauthorized transfers totaling over $15 million, were conducted using Ms. Whitmore's credentials, her login, her approval. And these, he said, holding up printed documents, contain her digital signature. A few jurors shifted in their seats. Danica swallowed hard. She had seen these records before, but never in this context, never as a weapon against her. The prosecutor continued, "And if that's not enough, we have a witness, a former colleague of Ms. Whitmore, someone who worked closely with her at Thorndike Capital, someone who, until today, held her in high regard." Danica's fingers curled into her palm as she saw Elliot Reese step onto the witness stand. He was a financial analyst, once part of her team. She remembered the late nights working together, the conversations about their ambitions. But now, as he adjusted the microphone, he wouldn't even look at her. "Mr. Reese," the prosecutor prompted, "can you tell the court about the conversation you had with Ms. Whitmore 2 months before these transactions occurred?" Elliot hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. She mentioned ways to maximize profit, that sometimes when opportunities presented themselves, people at her level found ways to, secure additional income. Danica felt the floor beneath her shift. That was not what she had said. "She outright suggested," Elliot continued, his voice steadying, "that with the right access, she could move company funds without immediate detection." A low murmur spread across the courtroom. The judge glanced over his glasses, tapping his gavel once to restore order. Danica clenched her jaw, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. This wasn't just a misinterpretation. It was a lie. The prosecutor turned back to her, his expression smug. "Ms. Whitmore, are you saying that all this evidence is fabricated? That you are completely innocent?" Silence. Danica knew the truth, but at this moment, even she couldn't explain the mountain of evidence stacked against her. The jury was watching, waiting for a response, their faces unreadable. Then, just as she drew a breath to speak, the heavy courtroom doors swung open with a loud bang. Heads turned. A group of men in dark suits strode in, their badges flashing under the fluorescent lights. "Special Agent Oliver Hayes, FBI," the lead agent announced, stepping forward. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room before locking onto the judge. "We have new evidence that might change the course of this trial." Danica barely registered the collective gasp that swept through the room. Her focus was on the agents, on the small folder in Hayes' hand, a lifeline, or another noose. But before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. 3 months earlier, the air inside Thorndike Capital's headquarters carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the faint tang of printer ink. The sound of keyboards clacking and phones ringing formed a steady hum, the rhythm of high-stakes financial operations running at full speed. Danica Whitmore sat at her desk, the glow of dual monitors illuminating her face. Rows of financial data scrolled past her screen, figures fluctuating as she reviewed the latest transactions. Numbers were her second language. She had spent years decoding spreadsheets and detecting anomalies before they snowballed into crises. But this one was different. She narrowed her eyes as she clicked on a particular entry. A $15.3 million transfer had been processed in increments over several months, each routed through different offshore accounts registered to shell corporations. On the surface, it looked clean, just another movement of capital in the firm's investment portfolio. But the moment she traced the destination of the funds, a pit formed in her stomach. Every account was linked to a jurisdiction notorious for shielding financial crimes. Danica exhaled slowly, rolling her chair back. She had flagged inconsistencies before, small discrepancies, clerical oversights, but nothing of this scale. This wasn't a mistake. This was calculated. She hesitated, then tapped out a quick email to internal auditing, attaching the flagged transactions. Her gut told her to escalate this further, but she knew the protocol. They would review, then forward the findings up the chain of command. Or so she thought. An hour passed, then two. No response. She walked down the hall to the compliance division, only to find their offices suspiciously empty. The glass walls reflected the sharp lines of the city skyline, but no one was inside. The usual hum of corporate activity had been replaced by a thick silence. Something was wrong. Then came the email, short, impersonal, and chilling in its precision. Meeting request, CEO's office. 6 p.m. Danica stared at the screen. The CEO, Dorian Stratton, had never summoned her directly. People didn't just get invited into his office. They were either promoted or erased. She felt the weight of her decision as she stepped into the executive floor later that evening. The office was immaculate, coldly sophisticated. Stratton sat behind his massive glass desk, his expression unreadable. "You've been asking questions," he said, his voice smooth, but carrying an unmistakable edge. Danica held his gaze. "There's a discrepancy in the financial reports. I need to know why these transfers weren't disclosed properly." Stratton let out a quiet chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "Drop it, Whitmore. This is bigger than you." She stiffened. There was no denial, no attempt to justify the numbers. Just a warning. "You're telling me to ignore an irregularity involving millions of dollars?" she asked, feeling the air shift between them. "I'm telling you to stay in your lane." Stratton's voice dropped lower. "Walk away from this, and you'll keep your career. Keep pushing, and you won't like where it leads." Danica clenched her jaw, the unspoken threat settling deep in her chest. The meeting ended without another word. But as she left his office, she noticed something. The way he barely looked up from his watch, as if he already knew how this conversation would end. Back at her desk, she found an envelope slipped beneath her keyboard. No name, no sender. Inside was a single sticky note with scribbled handwriting. "You're not the first. You won't be the last. Watch your back." She looked around, scanning the faces of her colleagues. No one met her gaze. She wasn't just dealing with numbers anymore. This was something much darker. Later that night, she met with Marlene Torres, a former senior accountant who had left Thorndike Capital under murky circumstances. They sat in the corner of a small diner, the buzz of conversations drowning out their whispers. Marlene stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her face shadowed by worry. "If you dig too deep, you might not make it out." Danica leaned in. "You worked there for years. You must have seen something." Marlene hesitated. Then just as she opened her mouth, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and her expression changed instantly. Fear. "I need to go," she whispered, hastily gathering her things. "Marlene," but she was already moving toward the door, disappearing into the night. Danica sat frozen, the unfinished conversation gnawing at her thoughts. Marlene knew something, and someone didn't want her to talk. Later that evening, as she walked home, her mind kept replaying every red flag she had ignored. Stratton's warning, the abandoned audit office, Marlene's abrupt departure. She was so lost in thought that she barely noticed the headlights in the distance. The roar of an engine shattered the silence. A car accelerating toward her. Instinct took over. She dove to the side, landing hard against the pavement as the vehicle raced past, missing her by inches. She gasped, heart pounding. The car never stopped. No hesitation, no second glance. Danica pushed herself up, hands trembling. This wasn't a random incident. Someone wanted her gone. The memory of that night slammed back into her like a freight train. She was back in the courtroom. The FBI agent stood in front of the judge, the room buzzing with shock. Danica stared at them, her breath still unsteady from the recollection. She wasn't just on trial for a fabricated crime. She was being hunted. The ride to the FBI field office was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the agent's radio. Danica sat in the back of the black government-issued SUV, staring out at the New York skyline. The courthouse had been a blur of murmurs and stares as she was escorted out. Some spectators whispering, others openly speculating. The weight of the day pressed on her. The trial was paused, but for how long? The FBI's intervention had bought her time, but it was no guarantee of her innocence. The vehicle pulled into an underground parking garage. Danica was led through a security checkpoint, past rows of agents buried in case files, the scent of burnt coffee and printer ink hanging in the air. At the far end of the corridor, Special Agent Oliver Hayes was waiting. He was in his mid-40s with graying hair at his temples, and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. His suit was neat, but his tie was slightly loosened, suggesting a man too busy to bother with appearances. "Ms. Whitmore," he greeted, motioning her to follow him into a glass-walled conference room. "We've been watching Thorndike Capital for a while. 2 years, to be exact." Danica took a seat across from him. "And?" Hayes exhaled. "And we think you're innocent. But thinking isn't enough. We need proof." She let out a humorless laugh. "Tell that to the jury. Right now, the only thing they see is a spreadsheet full of fraudulent transfers linked to my name." Hayes nodded. "That's exactly what they want. We have reason to believe Thorndike has been running a sophisticated financial laundering operation, shielding illegal money through shell corporations. Your case? It's a distraction. Someone needed a fall person, and you were convenient." Danica clenched her fists under the table. "So you're telling me I was set up from the start?" Hayes tapped a file in front of him. "We're telling you there's more at play here than just you. But if we're going to take this to court and dismantle whatever Thorndike is protecting, we need a way in. You worked there. You've seen things." Danica leaned back, considering his words. She had seen things, and she wasn't the only one. Isaiah Zay Carter was waiting for her in the lobby when she was finally allowed to leave. Danica hadn't seen him in months, not since his career had skyrocketed at his own firm, but now he stood with his arms crossed, watching as she approached, his sharp features set in an expression she couldn't quite place. "Zay," she said cautiously. "Danny," she sighed. "If you're here to say I told you so—" "I'm here because you called," he cut in, "and because whether I like it or not, you need help." She exhaled, relieved but wary. "I didn't do this, Zay." His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "The evidence against you is overwhelming, Danny. If we don't find something solid soon, you're going to prison." Danica swallowed, the truth of his words settling like lead in her stomach. "I need you to believe me," she said quietly. Zay studied her. Then after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "Then let's get to work." Danica's apartment was in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn, far from the steel and glass of Wall Street. But as she and Zay stepped inside, the place didn't feel like home. The door had been locked when she left, but now the moment she flipped on the light, she knew. Someone had been here. Her furniture was untouched, but her desk drawers were yanked open, papers scattered across the floor. The laptop she had left on her kitchen table was missing. Zay let out a low curse. This wasn't a robbery. Then she spotted it, a single white envelope sitting on her kitchen counter, its edges crisp, untouched. Zay reached it first, carefully peeling it open. Inside was a single slip of paper. 4 words typed. "Walk away while you still can." Danica stared at it. A warning. A final chance to back off. She grabbed the note, crumpling it in her fist. "Not a damn chance." Zay looked at her. "We need to find out who's behind this." She nodded, already moving to her backup drive, plugging it into a spare laptop she kept for emergencies. As she scrolled through the data she had saved, her pulse quickened. Then, there it was. A transaction she hadn't noticed before. A wire transfer from an unknown offshore entity buried beneath layers of legal documentation. It had been cleared 2 weeks before she was arrested. Zay leaned over her shoulder. That's not a standard transaction. No, she murmured. It's a setup. Someone had planted it, and now they were one step closer to figuring out who. Zay sat across from Danica in a dimly lit cafe in Midtown, his fingers drumming absently on the table as he stared at the laptop screen. The search results reflected off his glasses, lines of financial records and offshore accounts filling the page. She's the key, he muttered, clicking through another document. Danica leaned in. Marlene Torres? He nodded. The offshore account we found. It's linked to a financial trust in the Cayman Islands. And guess whose name pops up in old records? Danica barely breathed as she read the name. Marlene had handled internal accounts at Thorndike Capital for years, managing corporate filings and overseeing wire transfers. If there was anyone who had seen the skeletons in the company's closet, it was her. But the last she had heard, Marlene had vanished, gone without notice. No social media activity, no forwarding address. Danica exhaled. So we have a name, but no idea where she is. Zay cracked his knuckles. Not exactly. She used to rent an apartment in Queens. The lease ended abruptly 2 months ago, but she didn't sell her car. That means she didn't plan to disappear. Danica's stomach tightened. Then someone made her disappear. The building in Queens was the kind you walk past without noticing. Old brickwork, metal fire escapes winding up the side, the faint scent of rain lingering in the air. Zay knocked on the super's door while Danica kept an eye on the hallway. It was eerily quiet. No movement, no voices, just the occasional flicker of the overhead fluorescent lights. A gruff voice finally answered. Yeah? Zay pulled out a crisp $50 bill, sliding it forward. We're looking for a tenant, Marlene Torres. You remember her? The super eyed the bill, then them. Ain't seen her in weeks. Zay sighed. Did she leave anything behind? The man scratched his chin, debating, then pocketed the money. Apartment's still empty. Haven't rented it out yet. Danica and Zay exchanged a glance. That meant her place had been left untouched. Minutes later, they stepped inside Marlene's old unit. The air smelled of dust and abandonment. The furniture was gone, but Danica's eyes scanned the walls, the floorboards. People always left something behind. Then she saw it. A loose floorboard near the closet. She knelt, pried it up, and there it was. A small, silver external hard drive nestled in the dust. Got something? She whispered. Zay crouched beside her. Let's hope it's not just old tax returns. But as they stood to leave, the hallway outside creaked. Danica's breath caught. Zay moved first, peeking through the crack in the door. We've got company. The moment they stepped into the street, 2 men in dark coats followed. Danica's heartbeat kicked up. Zay's voice was low. Keep walking. She didn't look back. She could hear their footsteps behind them. Steady, purposeful. The kind that didn't belong to lost pedestrians. Then one of the men quickened his pace. Zay grabbed her wrist. Run! They took off, weaving through traffic, the honking of horns and the shouts of angry drivers ringing in their ears. Danica sprinted down an alley, Zay at her side. A dumpster blocked part of the path, and they vaulted over it just as a shout came from behind them. A sharp pop cracked the air. A gunshot. Danica's pulse roared in her ears. They were outmatched. Whoever these men were, they weren't just trying to scare them off. They wanted them gone. A fire escape ladder hung low on the side of a building. Zay gestured. Climb. She didn't argue. Hands gripping the metal, she hoisted herself up, moving fast. Zay followed just as their pursuers reached the alley. By the time they reached the rooftop, their lungs were burning. Danica peered over the edge. The men below scanned the alley, muttering something into their earpieces before disappearing into the night. Zay wiped sweat from his brow. That's the second time someone's tried to kill you in less than a week. Danica's fingers curled into fists. That means we're getting close. Back in Zay's office, the tension in the air was thick as they plugged the hard drive into his laptop. Folders filled the screen, emails, spreadsheets, scanned documents, and then something that made Danica's stomach drop. An email from a Thorndike Capital executive. Marlene is asking too many questions. If she doesn't back off, and we'll have to handle it. Zay exhaled sharply. They knew she was a problem. Danica stared at the screen, the weight of it pressing against her ribs. And now they think I am too. Then she saw something else. Her own name. Before the trial. Before the accusations. They had planned to set her up from the beginning. Zay scrolled through the financial records on his laptop, his fingers tapping impatiently on the table. The cafe they had chosen was mostly empty, the kind of place where no one paid attention to two people quietly talking over a laptop. She's alive, he muttered. Danica leaned in, eyes scanning the transaction history. This withdrawal, $2,000 cash, was made from an ATM near a rundown motel in New Jersey. That's not a lot of money if she's planning to stay off the grid for long. Which means she's not running, Zay said. She's hiding. Danica exhaled slowly. We need to get there before someone else does. The motel was the kind that made you question the last time the sheets had been washed. Neon lights flickered above the entrance, and a faded vacancy sign buzzed weakly. A tired-looking man sat behind the front desk, flipping through a magazine. Zay stepped forward, flashing a friendly smile. Hey, we're looking for someone who might have stayed here recently. A woman, late 40s, short hair, nervous type. The man barely looked up. We get a lot of those. Danica slid a $50 bill across the counter. She would have paid in cash. Checked in about a week ago. That got his attention. He scratched his head, glancing toward the keys hanging on the back wall. Yeah. Torres, right? She was here for a few nights, left in a hurry. Middle of the night, didn't even ask for her deposit back. Danica's stomach twisted. Did she say where she was going? The man shook his head. Nope, but she left her room in a mess. Cleaning lady wasn't happy. Mind if we take a look? Another $50 bill slid across the counter. The motel manager sighed, grabbed a key, and handed it to them. 15 minutes, then I never saw you. The room smelled like stale air and anxiety. The bed was unmade. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat forgotten on the nightstand, and the trash can was filled with crumpled receipts and napkins. Zay flipped through the stack of motel brochures on the table. She didn't plan to stay long. Danica scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. Then she spotted it, a crumpled piece of paper near the bed. She picked it up, smoothing it out. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. 3 words stood out. Redwood Diner. Midnight. Zay whistled. Think she's meeting someone? Danica's grip on the paper tightened. Or she was supposed to. They had barely stepped out of the motel when the air shifted. Danica felt it first, that eerie sensation of being watched. Then out of the corner of her eye, she spotted movement. 2 figures stood near the parking lot, their dark clothing blending into the shadows. Keep walking, Zay murmured. Danica's pulse quickened. They're the same guys from Queens, aren't they? Zay nodded. And they don't look like they're here for a conversation. One of the men took a step forward. Zay tensed. Run! They bolted. Danica heard footsteps pounding behind them, the sound of pursuit echoing through the empty lot. They cut through an alley, barely dodging an overflowing dumpster, but the men were fast. Too fast. Zay turned, throwing a punch as one of them lunged. The impact sent the man stumbling, but the second one moved in. A hard fist collided with Zay's ribs, knocking him backward. Danica didn't have time to think. She grabbed a loose brick from the ground and swung. The man cursed, staggering just long enough for Zay to shove him away. Move! Zay yelled. They turned the corner and headlights flashed. A car screeched to a stop inches from them. The driver's side door flew open. Get in! A woman's voice shouted. Danica barely had time to register who it was before she and Zay dove inside. The moment the doors shut, the tires screeched against the pavement. Breathing heavily, Danica turned to face the driver. Marlene Torres gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. They're coming for all of us, she said, her voice shaking, and we are out of time. Marlene gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The old sedan sped down the highway, its headlights cutting through the thick New Jersey night. The tension in the car was suffocating. Danica sat in the passenger seat, her pulse still racing from their near escape. Zay in the back kept glancing at the side mirrors, watching for any sign they were being followed. Marlene's voice finally broke the silence. "They're not just after me," she said, her breath uneven. "They're after all of us." Danica turned toward her. "What do you know?" Marlene exhaled sharply. "More than I should, and that's why I ran." She reached under her seat and pulled out a second external hard drive, identical to the one Danica had found in her apartment. She tossed it into Danica's lap. "That," Marlene said, eyes fixed on the road, "is the real reason I disappeared." Danica hesitated before plugging the drive into her laptop. As she scrolled through the files, her stomach clenched. The contents weren't just financial statements. There were detailed correspondences, confidential agreements, and encrypted transactions. Then she saw the names. Politicians. CEOs, high-ranking executives. "Dorian Stratton has been using Thorndike Capital to launder money," Marlene said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Millions of dollars funneled through fake investments, bounced through offshore accounts, the kind of dirty money that funds campaigns, builds empires, and disappears before anyone can trace it." Danica swallowed hard. "If this gets out, they'll burn everything to the ground before they let that happen." Marlene cut in. "You saw what they did to me. What they're doing to you." Danica clenched her jaw. The trial wasn't just about her. It was about keeping all of this buried. They pulled into a deserted gas station off the interstate. Zay stepped out to make a call, while Marlene rummaged through her bag, hands still trembling. Danica leaned against the car, the weight of everything sinking in. "We have to take this to the FBI." Marlene shook her head violently. "Number, you don't get it. This isn't just about Thorndike. There are people inside law enforcement who are part of this. They'll either kill the case or kill us. Maybe both." Danica frowned. "Then who do we trust?" Marlene's lips pressed into a thin line. "No one." They needed a safe place to lay low. Zay had a small apartment in Newark, an old rental he rarely used but kept for situations exactly like this. They drove in silence, the weight of paranoia settling in. When they arrived, the place was quiet, the city lights casting long shadows across the walls. Marlene paced, arms crossed. "We need a plan." Danica sat on the couch, scrolling through the files on the hard drive. "If we can find something undeniable, something that directly ties Stratton to these deals, we can force the case into the public eye before they have a chance to cover it up." Zay rubbed the back of his neck. "That's assuming we make it that far." Before Danica could respond, the apartment door burst open. Shouts filled the room as uniformed officers stormed in, weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them!" Danica barely had time to react before an officer grabbed her wrist, yanking her forward. Cold metal clamped around her wrists. "Danica Whitmore," the officer announced, his voice ringing in her ears, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence." Danica froze. Marlene's words echoed in her mind. "There are people inside law enforcement who are part of this." Her eyes darted towards Zay. He looked just as stunned, hands raised in surrender. Marlene had disappeared into the shadows. As the officers led Danica toward the door, she caught sight of a black SUV idling outside. Through the tinted glass, a familiar figure sat in the back seat. Dorian Stratton. He tilted his head slightly, lips curling into a smirk. Danica's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a setup, it was a warning. Danica sat motionless in the back of the transport van, her wrists bound in cold steel cuffs. The city lights flickered past through the barred window, casting distorted reflections against the metal interior. The silence inside was heavy, broken only by the occasional static from the radio up front. She had been in boardrooms, in high-rise offices, in places where numbers dictated the rise and fall of fortunes. But now she was just another inmate being processed into the federal detention system. As they pulled into the Metropolitan Detention Center, the sight of the towering razor wire fences made her stomach churn. The reality of her situation settled in. This wasn't a delay, a misunderstanding that would be resolved with a few calls. This was deliberate. The guards moved with detached efficiency, stripping her of any remaining dignity. Fingerprints, mugshot, the exchange of her tailored blazer for an orange jumpsuit that smelled of industrial detergent. Danica kept her head high, refusing to show weakness. But as she was led down the long, sterile hallway, she felt the weight of a dozen eyes on her. Some were curious, others indifferent. A few looked at her the way wolves look at wounded prey. She had spent her career analyzing risks, but this was a world where numbers didn't matter. Her assigned cell was a cramped, dimly lit box with concrete walls that still carried the faint scent of bleach. The cot was stiff, the air thick with the murmur of whispered conversations and distant laughter. Danica sat down, pressing her palms against her knees to steady herself. She had barely processed her surroundings when a voice spoke from the top bunk. "You don't belong here." She looked up. An older woman, maybe mid-60s, sat cross-legged on the upper cot, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun. Her eyes were sharp, assessing Danica the way a seasoned player sizes up a new opponent at the table. Danica exhaled. "That makes two of us." The woman smirked. "I wouldn't be so sure." There was something about her, calm, knowing, someone who had been through this before. "You worked in finance," the woman guessed. "I can see it in the way you carry yourself, the way you're still trying to calculate your odds." Danica tensed. "Relax," the woman continued. "I'm not going to ask what you did. Doesn't matter anyway. What matters is that you're sitting in a place where people like us don't just end up by accident." Danica narrowed her eyes. "People like us?" The woman's expression darkened. "You're not the first. They've done this before." A chill crawled down Danica's spine. "Who's they?" she asked. The woman leaned back, folding her arms. "That's the question, isn't it?" By the time Zay and the FBI managed to push through a bail hearing, the damage was already done. Danica walked out of the detention center, blinking against the sudden flash of camera lights. Reporters swarmed the sidewalk, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of accusations and speculation. "Ms. Whitmore, did you destroy evidence to cover your crimes? Are you working with Thorndike Capital? Do you have a statement about the FBI's involvement in your case?" Zay moved swiftly, shielding her from the crowd as they made their way to the waiting car. Inside, Danica let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "They're turning you into the villain," Zay muttered. "It's a damn circus out there." Danica clenched her fists. That was the plan. Make her toxic. Make her look guilty. That way, even if she got out of this, her credibility would be in shambles. Zay handed her a folder. "FBI's been combing through the financials, but it's a mess. Someone's been cleaning house, scrubbing records, erasing trails." Danica flipped it open, scanning the reports. Her eyes caught on something at the bottom, a slip of paper, folded, neatly tucked into the folder. She frowned and pulled it out. A single row of numbers stared back at her. A long sequence, like a financial account number. Her stomach tightened. "What is this?" Zay glanced at it. "That wasn't in the file when I got it." Danica's pulse quickened. Someone had slipped it into her things while she was inside. She looked out the window, scanning the streets, but there was nothing unusual. "Someone wanted me to find this," she murmured. Zay pulled out his laptop. "Let's see where it leads." Minutes passed as he worked, then he froze. Danica leaned in. "What is it?" Zay exhaled. "This isn't a new account. It's a transaction ID from a case 10 years ago." He turned the screen toward her. It was a money laundering scandal that had been buried under corporate settlements and sealed records. Danica's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about Thorndike Capital. This was bigger, and whoever had orchestrated it had been doing this for a decade, maybe longer. Her mind reeled. If that was true, then Dorian Stratton wasn't the one pulling the strings. Someone higher up, someone untouchable, was controlling everything from the shadows. The address led them to a nondescript office building in Lower Manhattan, the kind of place that once bustled with financial brokers and high-stakes transactions, but now sat half-abandoned, a relic of a corporate empire that had quietly crumbled. Danica and Zay stepped inside, the scent of dust and old paper lingering in the air. A single flickering light illuminated the narrow hallway as they followed the faded directory plaque to Suite 407. Zay knocked, glancing over his shoulder. "I don't like this," he muttered. Danica didn't either. The door creaked open, revealing a man in his 60s, thin-frame glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. His gaze darted between them, cautious but curious. "You found the number," he said, voice raspy. Danica hesitated. "You sent it?" The man stepped aside, motioning them in. "I sent nothing, but someone wanted you here. Inside, the office was sparse. Filing cabinets, an old desk, a coffee maker that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The man gestured toward two chairs. "You have 5 minutes before I change my mind." Danica sat. "We're investigating Thorndike Capital. We know about the offshore accounts, the laundering." The man scoffed. "That's not news. The real question is, why now?" Zay leaned forward. "Because they framed Danica for it." That got his attention. His fingers drummed against the desk as he studied her. "You worked there." Danica nodded. The man exhaled slowly. "Then you should have known better." Her jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" He glanced toward the door, as if checking for unseen eyes. Thorndike wasn't just a firm. It was a system, a pipeline for dirty money, funding elections, silencing opposition, buying influence. The kind of machine that doesn't just collapse, it evolves. Danica felt her pulse quicken. "Marlene Torres knew about this, didn't she?" The man gave a slow nod. "And she wasn't the only one." Danica exchanged a look with Zay. If Marlene had known, who else had been pulling at the thread before her? The moment they stepped back onto the street, Danica knew something was wrong. Zay stiffened beside her. "We've got company." A black SUV sat idling across the street, tinted windows masking whoever was inside. Then the roar of an engine erupted behind them. Danica barely had time to react before a sedan sped toward them. "Move!" Zay yanked her back just as the car veered onto the sidewalk, barely missing them. The impact sent a trash bin flying, shattering glass from a storefront. Danica's heart pounded as she and Zay sprinted toward the nearest alley. Footsteps echoed behind them. Whoever was in the SUV wasn't just watching anymore. They reached a side street, ducking behind a parked truck. Danica peered out, catching sight of a lone figure standing across the street, watching them. He wasn't chasing them. He wasn't running. He was simply waiting. Danica's breath caught. Whoever he was, he wanted them to know he was there. An hour later, back at Zay's office, the tension in the air was palpable. Danica sat at the desk, fingers drumming against the armrest as Zay scrolled through his laptop. "FBI just sent over a name," he said. Danica leaned in. "Who?" Zay turned the screen toward her. "A government official, linked to previous financial scandals but never convicted. A man whose influence stretched across industries, tied to Thorndike Capital through hushed campaign donations and corporate shell entities." Danica's stomach turned. If they were going after him, this wasn't just about proving her innocence anymore. This was about taking down an empire. She exhaled. "How do we get to him?" Zay's jaw tightened. "That's the problem. Because the moment they made a move, they wouldn't be the hunters anymore. They'd be the hunted." The air inside the car was thick with tension. Danica sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the Washington skyline as Zay drove, his grip tight on the steering wheel. The radio played softly, a steady hum beneath the weight of unspoken thoughts. "Are we really doing this?" Zay finally asked, glancing at her. Danica exhaled. "Do we have a choice?" They both knew the answer. The FBI had warned them. Senator Robert Calloway was untouchable. The man had spent decades embedding himself in the highest circles of power, backed by corporate giants and political allies who had more to lose than he did. He wasn't just a participant in the corruption. They suspected he was one of its architects. And yet, here they were. The private club in Georgetown was the kind of place where deals were made over expensive bourbon, and a handshake meant more than a signed contract. The entrance was discreet, the valet service impeccable. Zay adjusted his tie. "This is a terrible idea." Danica smoothed the lapel of her blazer. "Then why are you still here?" He sighed. "Because I don't trust you to do it alone." Inside, the club was dimly lit, the scent of aged whiskey and cigar smoke lingering in the air. Men in tailored suits exchanged quiet conversations, their laughter controlled, their movements calculated. A server guided them to a corner booth. A moment later, Robert Calloway slid into the seat across from them. He was older than his campaign photos suggested, but no less imposing. His silver hair was neatly combed, his suit impeccable. But what stood out most was his unshakable confidence, the air of a man who had been in control for far too long. He adjusted his cufflinks, then looked up at them with mild amusement. "I must admit, I was curious when I got your message. Not many people have the nerve to request a meeting with me under these circumstances. Danica leaned forward. We know about Thorndyke Capital. We know about the money laundering, and we know your name is tied to it. Calloway smiled, slow and deliberate. And? Zay's jaw clenched. And we have proof. Calloway swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Then I suppose the real question is, what do you think you're going to do with it? Danica met his gaze. We're going to make sure you can't bury it. For a moment, he just watched her. Then he chuckled, shaking his head. Ms. Whitmore, you're playing a game you can't win. His voice was calm, almost pitying. I understand why you think you have a shot, he continued. You're smart, ambitious. But do you really believe that a few bank records and encrypted emails will bring down an empire that's been built over decades? Danica didn't blink. It's a start. Calloway leaned back, setting his glass down. You're missing the point. This isn't about you. This isn't even about Thorndyke. It's bigger than one company, one CEO. You could expose the truth tomorrow, and within a week another firm will take its place. Another name. Another system. Nothing changes. Danica felt Zay shift beside her. They both knew Calloway wasn't just posturing. He believed what he was saying, and that made him even more dangerous. I could end this conversation right now, he said, tapping his fingers against the table. One call and this entire ordeal disappears. Your trial? Gone. Your reputation? Restored. You go back to living your life, and this never happened. Danica's stomach twisted. And if I don't? Calloway's smile faded. Then you'll learn the hard way what happens to people who don't know when to walk away. The words hung between them, a quiet warning wrapped in polished civility. Then without another word, he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked away. They didn't even make it to the car. The attack came fast. Two men in black suits emerging from the shadows, their movements practiced, professional. Danica barely had time to react before a sharp blow to the ribs sent her stumbling backward. Zay threw a punch, connecting with one of them, but the second man was already moving. A hard strike to the back of his head sent Zay crumpling to the pavement. Danica tried to run, but a strong hand clamped over her mouth. Darkness swallowed her as she was dragged into a waiting van. She woke to the sound of footsteps. The air was damp, laced with the scent of oil and rust. Her wrists were bound, her head pounding as she blinked into the dim light. A warehouse, and standing a few feet away, watching her with unsettling calm, was Dorian Stratton. He looked exactly as she remembered. Tailored suit, polished shoes, the same quiet arrogance. But this time he wasn't pretending to be a CEO. This time he was just the man who had orchestrated everything. Danica's voice was hoarse. You really went through all this trouble just to gloat? Dorian smirked. Oh, Danica, if I wanted to gloat, you'd already be dead. He crouched beside her, his tone almost friendly. I told you, didn't I, that you should have dropped this. Danica met his gaze, refusing to show fear. You set me up. Dorian shrugged. Of course I did. You were perfect, a rising star, just high enough to make it believable, but not powerful enough to fight back. Danica clenched her fists. And what now? You're just going to kill me? Dorian sighed as if disappointed. That's so messy and unnecessary. He pulled out a thick envelope, dropping it onto the floor in front of her. Here's how this plays out, he said. You take the money, disappear. Maybe somewhere nice. Europe, South America. Start over. Danica's jaw tightened. And if I don't? Dorian's expression darkened. Then you end up like Marlene. The words hit like a slap, ice running through her veins. He stood, straightening his cuffs. You have one night to decide. The warehouse door slammed shut behind him, leaving her in the dark. Danica sat motionless, her wrists still bound, the thick envelope of hush money at her feet. The damp air of the warehouse clung to her skin, the scent of oil and rust lingering. Dorian stood a few feet away, his smirk unwavering. He had given her a choice, vanish or die, and he had no doubt which one she would pick. She took a slow breath, lifting her chin. I'm not going anywhere. Dorian's smirk barely faltered. He exhaled, almost amused. Danica, you're too smart for this. She didn't break eye contact. Then you should have picked someone dumber to frame. Dorian's expression hardened. He tilted his head slightly and one of his men stepped forward. The glint of a silenced handgun caught the dim light. Danica's pulse pounded, but she didn't flinch. You could have made this easy, Dorian mused, stepping back. But I respect conviction, even when it's suicidal. The gunman raised his weapon. A sharp crack rang through the warehouse. But it wasn't from his gun. The metal door burst open. Shouts echoed off the concrete walls. A second later, gunfire erupted, sending Dorian's men scrambling. Danica ducked as bullets ripped through crates, splintering wood, the air thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder. The gunman who had been ready to execute her collapsed from a single precise shot. Through the chaos, she heard a familiar voice. Danica! Zay. A second later, strong hands ripped the restraints from her wrists and she was pulled to her feet. She turned, eyes locking onto Special Agent Oliver Hayes. We're getting you out of here, Hayes said, his voice calm despite the chaos. Danica barely had time to register the scene. FBI agents flooding in, Dorian's men either retreating or being taken down in bursts of controlled gunfire. Dorian himself was already moving, slipping through a side exit, his tailored suit barely even dusted by the carnage around him. He's getting away, Danica yelled. Hayes pressed a weapon into her palm. Not if we stop him. They burst through the back door, emerging into the night. Dorian was already at a waiting SUV, his driver yanking open the door. Danica raised the gun, heart pounding. She could end this right here, but a second vehicle skidded into view, FBI backup. Dorian hesitated for half a second too long. An agent tackled him before he could reach the SUV. He struggled, his polished composure finally breaking as he was shoved face first into the asphalt, handcuffs clicking into place. Danica took a shaky breath, lowering the gun. It was over, or so she thought. Back inside the warehouse, agents swept the area, securing evidence, arresting the last of Dorian's men. Zay walked over, rubbing his temple where he had taken a hit earlier. You okay? Danica nodded, still catching her breath. How did you... I got a text, Zay interrupted. From you. Danica blinked. I didn't send a... But then her gaze fell on a discarded burner phone, its screen still faintly glowing. Someone had tipped them off. Someone inside Dorian's own operation. Before she could process that, Hayes called out, We found something. Danica and Zay followed him toward a hidden panel behind one of the warehouse's rusted-out crates. Inside was a small metal box, locked. An agent pried it open. Inside was a USB drive. Danica stared. Zay grabbed it, plugging it into a field laptop. As the files loaded, his eyes widened. This isn't just offshore accounts, he murmured. This is everything. Danica leaned in. Lists of transactions, correspondences, names. Not just Thorndike Capital, not just Dorian. Politicians, CEOs, high-level government officials. Her breath caught. This wasn't just enough to prove her innocence. This could bring down the entire system. She looked up at Hayes. We take this public. He hesitated. Danica, you understand what you're saying? Once this gets out, you can't undo it. These aren't just criminals. These are people with real power, the kind that don't go down without a fight. Danica swallowed, her gaze drifting back to the USB drive in her hand. She had a choice. She could walk away now. The FBI could use this quietly, let the system handle it, minimize her risk. Or she could make sure everyone saw the truth. Danica clenched her fist. I won't let them get away with this. Hayes studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. Then let's take them down. The trial wasn't over, but now Danica had the upper hand. The courtroom was packed. The hum of murmurs filled the air as people shuffled into their seats, their eyes flicking toward the defense table where Danica sat beside Zay. The weight of the moment pressed against her ribs, but she refused to let it show. This time was different. This wasn't just about proving her innocence anymore. It was about exposing an entire system of corruption. The judge entered, and the courtroom settled into silence. The prosecution wasted no time. Your Honor, the lead prosecutor, Evelyn Dawson, began as she stepped forward, her sharp eyes locking onto Danica. While the defense claims to have uncovered new evidence, we must emphasize that this does not exonerate Ms. Whitmore. She turned to the jury. The prosecution maintains that the financial transactions in question were linked to her credentials. Her clearance allowed these transfers to occur, and regardless of what she claims now, the evidence still places her at the center of this operation. Danica's jaw tightened. She had expected this. They weren't going to let her walk away that easily. Zay stood, buttoning his suit jacket with calculated ease. The prosecution continues to paint my client as the mastermind behind this, but let's not ignore the reality, he said smoothly. The same system that now claims she's guilty is the one that failed to detect these fraudulent transactions in the first place. Why? Because it was designed to fail. He walked to the jury box. Thorndike Capital didn't just accidentally lose millions in offshore accounts. Someone inside the company built that framework deliberately, and it sure as hell wasn't my client. Zay turned to the judge. Your Honor, we request that the jury review the historical financial records of Thorndike Capital, records that predate Ms. Whitmore's employment. The prosecution objected immediately. Your Honor, this is a distraction, Dawson countered. The trial is about Ms. Whitmore's role, not about company-wide mismanagement. But the judge leaned forward. Overruled. The jury will have access to the records. A ripple of tension moved through the prosecution's table. For the first time, their case was slipping. Then came the moment no one expected. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Marlene Torres stepped inside. Gasps spread across the spectators. The woman who had vanished for months, who had been presumed either dead or too terrified to come forward, was here. Danica barely breathed as Marlene took the stand. She looked thinner, exhausted, but there was a fire in her eyes as she raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. Zay approached. Ms. Torres, can you tell the court why you disappeared? Marlene took a steady breath. Because they tried to kill me. The room erupted in whispers. Who is they? Zay pressed. Marlene's gaze swept across the room before landing on Dorian Stratton, who sat at the prosecution's table, his expression unreadable. The people who run Thorndike Capital, she said, and the people who protect them. Zay stepped closer. You worked as an accountant for Thorndike Capital for over 10 years. What did you discover? Marlene pulled a small folder from her purse. This, she said, holding it up, is a log of transactions that never made it into the official records. These were payments moved through shell corporations, disguised as investments. But the money was actually being funneled into offshore accounts controlled by some of the most powerful people in the country. She paused, then added, Dorian Stratton was the one signing off on those transactions. Dorian didn't even flinch. He simply watched. Waiting. Zay took the folder, flipping through it for the jury to see. Your Honor, these are internal accounting records, signed, dated, and verified by Thorndike executives. They prove that not only was my client uninvolved, but that this was an orchestrated effort spanning years. Dawson was already shaking her head. Your Honor, we object to the use of these documents. On what grounds? Zay asked sharply. The chain of custody, Dawson snapped. There's no proof these weren't tampered with. Zay's eyes narrowed. You mean there's no proof they were tampered with? The judge sighed. The objection is noted. We'll review the documents before they are admitted as evidence. Danica's stomach dropped. This wasn't good. They had the proof. But if the court ruled it inadmissible, it would mean nothing. And as if sensing her unease, Dorian finally smiled. That smug, knowing smirk that said he had already planned for this. When the court adjourned for the day, Danica barely made it to the hallway before Zay pulled her aside. They're trying to stall, he muttered. If they delay long enough, they'll find a way to get that evidence thrown out. Danica ran a hand over her face. Then we need something they can't ignore. Her phone buzzed. A blocked number. Frowning, she stepped away and answered. Who is this? A distorted voice replied, low and deliberate. You're getting close. Watch your back. Danica's grip tightened around the phone. Who are you? Silence. Then the line went dead. She turned to Zay, her chest tightening. Someone's watching us. Zay exhaled slowly. The question is, are they trying to help us? Or were they just waiting for the right moment to strike? The headlines came first. Danica woke up to the glow of her phone screen, her inbox flooded with messages. She hesitated before tapping one of the links. The moment the article loaded, her stomach dropped. Danica Whitmore, corporate sellout or desperate opportunist? Her eyes scanned the text. The article painted her as a bitter ex-employee, someone trying to tear down a respected financial institution out of revenge. She clicked another. Former Thorndike analyst attempts to sabotage company amidst market instability. Danica let out a slow breath. She knew this was coming. Dorian was fighting back. The television in the corner of Zay's office buzzed with news coverage. A suited analyst spoke confidently to the camera. Let's be clear, Thorndike Capital has been a pillar of the financial industry for decades. These allegations, they're reckless. And let's not ignore who's making them. A woman with a vendetta, trying to escape charges by dragging a respected firm down with her. Danica clenched her jaw. This wasn't just damage control. This was a full-scale attack. The courtroom was colder today, or maybe it was just the mood. Dorian sat at his table, flanked by his legal army, a team of top-tier defense attorneys, each one polished and lethal. Danica and Zay could feel the shift in the room. The jury wasn't looking at her the same way anymore. Doubt was creeping in. Then came the real hit. The prosecution called their next witness, a former Thorndike executive, supposedly there to verify financial records. Instead, he pivoted the entire narrative. The truth is, the man said smoothly, glancing toward the jury, Ms. Whitmore was a rising star at Thorndike, but when her access was restricted, she started looking for ways to undermine the company. Danica gripped the edge of the table. Lies. She always had ambitions beyond her role, the man continued. I believe she saw an opportunity to fabricate a scandal that would put her in the public eye. Dorian didn't even look at her. He didn't have to, because he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't trying to prove her guilty. He was planting just enough doubt to make the jury hesitate. They needed something bigger. That night, in the dim glow of Zay's office, they combed through every file, every document, every hidden detail they had left. There has to be something, Danica muttered, her fingers tightening around the mouse. Something that ties him directly to this. Zay rubbed his temples. We have offshore accounts. We have shell companies. But none of it puts his fingerprints on the crime. Danica stared at the screen, mind racing. Then she saw it. A folder tucked inside one of the archived company drives. An audio file, mislabeled under routine compliance reports. Her pulse spiked as she clicked it. A voice crackled through the speakers. Dorian's voice. Thorndike Capital has been laundering money for years. And now, we just need to tie up loose ends. Danica and Zay froze. She turned to him. This is it. Zay's face was unreadable. You know what happens if we use this, right? Danica nodded. If this went public, it wouldn't just take down Dorian, it would shake the entire political system tied to Thorndike. Powerful people would come after them. We don't have a choice, she said. Zay didn't argue. He just picked up his phone. The next morning, they delivered the evidence to the FBI. Danica felt like they were finally winning, until everything fell apart. Zay's phone buzzed. He frowned. Marlene was supposed to check in with us an hour ago. Danica's stomach turned. Call her. He tried. Straight to voicemail. Then his phone pinged. A message from an unknown number. A photo of Marlene's car, abandoned. The trunk left open, empty. Then a text. Not everyone gets to walk away. Back off. Danica felt her heartbeat hammering in her ears. They had Marlene. FBI agents scrambled as the news spread. But before they could take action, another piece of information surfaced. A mole. A leak inside the justice system, working against them. If they didn't act fast, Marlene would be gone. And with her, their last chance to take Dorian down. The clock was against them. Danica paced inside Zay's office, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The image of Marlene's abandoned car was burned into her mind. The empty trunk, the chilling message. Not everyone gets to walk away. Zay stood by the window, his fingers tapping against the sill, deep in thought. FBI tracked down security footage, he finally said. A black SUV was spotted near Marlene's last known location. No plates, no facial recognition hits. Whoever took her knew exactly what they were doing. Danica clenched her jaw. They're trying to silence her before she can testify. Zay nodded. If she doesn't make it to court, Dorian's legal team will argue that all her testimony is hearsay. And without her, we lose one of our strongest pieces of evidence. Danica exhaled, trying to think past the pounding in her head. We need to find her. Now. Hours later, a break came. An FBI analyst traced the SUV's movement using traffic cameras. The last sighting put it heading toward an industrial area on the outskirts of New Jersey. A warehouse district, Hayes confirmed, scanning the satellite images. It's isolated. Minimal surveillance. If they're holding her anywhere, it's there. Danica exchanged a glance with Zay. There was no question. This was their only shot. Hayes signaled to his team. We move in fast. No mistakes. Danica grabbed his arm before he could leave. I'm coming. Hayes shook his head. It's too dangerous. She's here because of me, Danica said firmly. I'm not sitting this out. Hayes studied her for a moment, then gave a reluctant nod. Stay behind cover. No heroics. Danica didn't answer. She wasn't making any promises. The warehouse loomed in the night, its metal walls rusted and worn. The only sign of life was a single dim light above a side door. The FBI agents spread out, moving in silence. Danica stayed close to Hayes, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Then, a noise inside. Hayes signaled. A swift motion, and the door burst open. Inside, Marlene was tied to a chair, her face bruised but defiant. A man stood near her, a gun resting casually in his grip. He looked up, unfazed by the intrusion. FBI, Hayes commanded. Drop the weapon. The man smirked. You have no idea what you're walking into. Another figure stepped forward from the shadows. A tall man in a charcoal suit, his expression unreadable. Danica had never seen him before, but the weight of power clung to him like a second skin. He eyed her with mild curiosity. Danica Whitmore, you've been quite the disruption. She didn't blink. Who are you? He ignored the question. Dorian Stratton was never your real problem. A chill ran down her spine. Zay had said it from the start. Thorndike Capital wasn't just a company, it was part of something bigger, and now she was looking at proof. The man gave a small, knowing smile. You're playing a much bigger game than you realize. Danica's fist clenched. She didn't care. Let Marlene go, she demanded. The man tilted his head. You're in no position to make demands. The air stretched tight, every second dragging like an eternity. Then, gunfire erupted outside. The distraction was all the FBI needed. Agents stormed in, taking down the armed men before they could react. Danica ran straight to Marlene, untying her restraints. Marlene's voice was hoarse. Took you long enough. Danica managed a small, relieved smile. You're okay? Marlene nodded weakly. I will be. Hayes grabbed Danica's arm. We need to move. Now. They rushed out, FBI agents covering their retreat. As they reached the waiting vehicles, Danica stole one last glance at the warehouse. The man in the charcoal suit was gone, but his words stayed with her. She wasn't just fighting Dorian Stratton. She was going up against something far worse, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what came next. By the time they arrived back at the courthouse, the trial was already in session. Zay was inside, stalling as best he could. Danica and Marlene rushed through the doors, breathless but ready. As they entered the courtroom, every eye turned toward them. Dorian's smug expression faltered. Marlene took the witness stand, and Danica knew this was far from over. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that weighed on the air like an impending storm. Every seat was filled, from reporters scribbling frantically in their notepads to high-profile spectators drawn in by the spectacle. The tension was palpable, thick with anticipation. Then the doors opened. Marlene Torres stepped inside. She walked with measured determination, her bruises barely visible beneath the makeup, but her posture was unwavering. She was a woman who had spent too long in hiding, and now she was here to finish what she started. Danica exhaled slowly, watching as Marlene took her place on the witness stand. Across the room, Dorian Stratton remained composed, his expression unreadable. He was the picture of control, but Danica knew better. Underneath that calm facade, he was calculating. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber. Ms. Torres, please state your name for the record. Marlene met his gaze without hesitation. Marlene Torres. And your occupation? She glanced toward the jury, then at Dorian. Former senior accountant at Thorndike Capital. A whisper rippled through the courtroom. The prosecution stood. Ms. Torres, you disappeared for months. Can you tell the court why? Marlene's jaw tightened. Because I was afraid for my life. The jury leaned in. She continued. I discovered financial irregularities within Thorndike Capital, accounts that weren't adding up, transfers to offshore banks under shell companies. When I asked questions, I was warned to stop. When I didn't, I became a target. Danica stole a glance at Dorian. He hadn't moved, but the clench of his jaw was all she needed to see. The prosecution nodded. Do you have proof of these transactions? Marlene reached into her folder and held up a thick stack of documents. These are internal records I kept. Real ledgers, not the falsified ones Thorndike Capital submitted to regulators. They show exactly how the money was funneled through fake corporations and into offshore accounts. A hush fell over the courtroom. Then the moment that changed everything. A screen flickered on. FBI played the recording. Dorian's voice filled the courtroom. Thorndike Capital has been laundering money for years. And now, we just need to tie up loose ends. There was no mistaking it. It was his voice, his confession. Dorian's posture stiffened. A murmur spread through the spectators. The jury exchanged glances, the shift in their expressions immediate. For the first time, Dorian Stratton looked shaken. His lawyer shot up. Your Honor, we object to the admission of this recording. The chain of custody is unclear. Say stood before the judge could respond. Your Honor, the authenticity of the recording has already been verified by forensic analysts. The FBI obtained it directly from Thorndike Capital's servers. The judge barely hesitated before turning to the prosecution. Motion to exclude the evidence is denied. Danica could see the fury simmering beneath Dorian's surface. But he wasn't finished yet. He leaned back, regaining his composure. This is absurd. A company as large as Thorndike makes countless transactions a day. You think one out-of-context recording proves anything? The prosecution didn't flinch. You're right, Mr. Stratton. One recording isn't enough. Zay straightened his suit. That's why we have more. A new series of emails appeared on the screen. Dorian's name was all over them. Correspondence with high-ranking government officials, judges, attorneys, bank executives. The subject lines alone sent a wave of unease through the courtroom, ensuring a favorable verdict. Wire transfers confirmed, no paper trail. Status of judicial influence secured. Zay turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just fraud. It's corruption on a scale that reaches far beyond Thorndike Capital. A cold chill passed through the room. Dorian's hands clenched into fists. His lawyer scrambled. This is all circumstantial. Then another bombshell. A man in a dark suit entered the courtroom, escorted by federal agents. The room gasped in recognition. A federal prosecutor, one who had once declined to press charges against Thorndike, walked straight to the stand. He was here to testify. He took his seat, adjusting his tie, his face grim. I'm here to confess. Dead silence. I was paid to bury investigations into Thorndike Capital, he admitted. I accepted bribes to redirect federal attention elsewhere. It was over. Danica didn't need to look at Dorian to know. He had lost. As the judge called for order, another announcement shook the courtroom to its core. An FBI agent entered and approached the prosecution. A quiet exchange of words, then a nod. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, the Department of Justice has issued additional arrest warrants. Effective immediately, law enforcement will be detaining multiple individuals involved in this conspiracy, including high-ranking government officials. Dorian's face went pale. Danica watched the realization sink in. He wasn't just losing his freedom. He was losing his entire network of protection. His empire was crumbling before his eyes. Bailiffs moved in. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom. Mr. Stratton, you are hereby remanded into federal custody. Your trial will proceed with the full weight of the evidence presented. Dorian rose, his expression a mask of fury and disbelief. Danica met his gaze. He had tried to destroy her. Now he was the one being led away in handcuffs. As he passed, he muttered under his breath, This isn't over. Danica didn't blink. You're right, because this fight was bigger than just one man. She had won today, but she knew the battle for real justice was just beginning. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on the jury box, waiting. The foreman stood adjusting his tie before clearing his throat. In the case of the United States versus Dorian Stratton, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. A wave of reaction swept through the room. Some gasped, others nodded in grim satisfaction. The weight of the decision finally came crashing down. Danica exhaled, her shoulders slumping slightly. She wasn't sure if it was relief or exhaustion, but the battle felt like it was coming to an end. The judge's gavel struck. Dorian Stratton is hereby sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Dorian didn't flinch. His expression remained impassive, but Danica caught the flicker of rage in his eyes. He had played the game and lost. He was led away in handcuffs. As he passed, he gave her one last look. "This isn't over," he murmured. Danica met his gaze unshaken. "I know," and she did, because Dorian was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The fallout was swift. Thorndike Capital collapsed overnight, its assets frozen by federal investigators. Shareholders scrambled, some trying to cut deals, others going into hiding. News anchors filled the airwaves, breaking down the massive financial scandal that had shaken Wall Street and Washington alike. But the damage wasn't just corporate. Several high-profile politicians resigned after being linked to the scandal. Some were already facing grand jury indictments. Others, they simply disappeared from the public eye, waiting for the storm to pass. Zay became the man of the hour. His defense of Danica had not only cleared her name, but also cemented his reputation as a lawyer who fought for justice, no matter the odds. He was offered a high-profile position at a major civil rights firm, one dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and those crushed by the system. Marlene, however, had a different path. She had seen what power could do. 1 week after the verdict, she packed her bags and left the city, heading somewhere quiet, somewhere she could start over. Danica understood. She wasn't sure if she could ever do the same. In the days that followed, Danica tried to find closure, but something kept gnawing at her. She had won, but had she really won? Yes, Dorian was behind bars. Yes, Thorndike was finished. But what about the others? What about the men in dark suits, the ones who had backed Thorndike, the ones pulling the strings from the shadows? She had seen their power firsthand. They didn't make headlines. They didn't show up in courtrooms. But they were there, and they weren't done. Late one night, a knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She hesitated. No one had called ahead. When she opened it, no one was there. Just an envelope on the floor. No name. No return address. She picked it up cautiously, bringing it inside before she peeled it open. Inside was a single photograph. Dorian Stratton, shaking hands with a man in a tailored suit. A government seal on the wall behind them. Below the image, a single sentence was scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. "You exposed one. But how many more are out there?" Danica's breath hitched. She stared at the message, at the implication. Dorian wasn't the end of this story. The city felt different. Danica sat by the window of her apartment, staring out at the skyline. The streets below bustled with life. Taxis honking, pedestrians moving with purpose. It was the same city she had always known, yet it wasn't. Not after what had happened. She had fought for her name, and she had won. But victory didn't bring the peace she thought it would. Her inbox was still flooded with media requests, journalists wanting exclusive interviews about the trial, about her fight against Thorndike Capital. Some called her a hero, others an opportunist. The truth? She felt like neither. The weight of what she had uncovered still pressed on her. The names, the connections, the people who had managed to slip away while Dorian took the fall. She thought of the photo that had been slipped under her door. You exposed one, but how many more are out there? Danica had spent her career following numbers, but now she was following shadows, and the question haunted her. Was she really free, or was she just at the beginning of something bigger? Zay showed up unannounced, as he always did. He tossed his coat over the back of a chair and grabbed a bottle of water from her fridge, making himself at home. "So," he said, twisting off the cap, "trial's over. You're cleared. You're technically unemployed. What's next?" Danica smirked, shaking her head. "I haven't figured that out yet." Zay arched an eyebrow. "Liar, I know that look." She didn't deny it. He took a sip of water, watching her. "You could walk away, you know. No one would blame you. Take some cushy corporate job. Rebuild your life. Actually sleep at night." Danica leaned back, arms crossed. "And pretend I don't know what I know?" Zay exhaled, setting the bottle down. "I had a feeling you'd say that." Danica turned to face him fully. Thorndyke wasn't just one corrupt company, Zay. It was part of something bigger, something systemic. Dorian's gone, but the people backing him, they're still out there. They'll find someone new. Keep the cycle going. Zay was silent for a moment, then nodded. "So what's the plan?" Danica hesitated, but only for a second. "I'm starting something." Zay leaned in. "Something?" Danica's voice was steady. "An independent investigative team. No corporate backing, no political ties. Just people who want the truth. Journalists, lawyers, whistleblowers, people who actually give a damn about holding the powerful accountable." Zay let out a low whistle. "That's dangerous." She shrugged. So was going up against Thorndyke. A slow smile spread across Zay's face. "You know I'm in, right?" Danica rolled her eyes. "I never doubted it. Justice isn't just about winning a case. It's about what happens after the verdict is read." Danica cleared her name, but in doing so, she uncovered something much bigger than herself. Corruption doesn't end with one conviction. For every Dorian Stratton that falls, another is waiting in the shadows, ready to take his place. The real question isn't who got caught, but who's still out there, manipulating the system while the world looks away. And that brings us to you. If you knew something, if you saw the truth behind the headlines, would you be willing to fight for it? Let us know in the comments. Would you risk everything to expose the powerful? And if you want more stories like this, stories about justice, power, and the fight for truth, don't forget to subscribe.